Okay, this video will cover indifference curves. We're going to show how to graph an indifference curve and then an entire family of indifference curves. These indifference curves give us a way to describe the preferences of consumers. So this is a part of consumer theory, that how it is that we economists model the behavior of consumers. We assume that people have preferences, and these are going to be represented by their utility function or their indifference curve. So we're going to go to the indifference curve part of it. We're going to assume that the indifference curves are coming from a utility function. But in this case, I'll talk through a version where we could get an indifference curve or trace out an indifference curve without actually talking about the utility function. So people like goods. So what we're going to assume is a model in which people are consuming two different goods. Now, I'm going to be very generic here, and we'll call them good X and good Y. And here we have a graph. So in any with this diagram and every figure that we have in this class, a first thing to pay attention to is what's on the axis. So we have quantities of two different goods on the axes. And points on this graph would represent, in effect, what we call consumption bundles. They're a combination of the two goods. So we might have a point over here that might have like 10 units of good X and 3 units of good Y. And you think of that as that would be the coordinates of a point in this space, and we could think of it as a bundle. And imagine a consumer going to the store and finding good X on the shelf, and they put 10 units of good X on into their cart, and then they put 3 units of good Y into their cart, and then they go and they check out, and they pay money to check out. The paying for it will be the budget constraint part of that. We'll get to that in a later video. But today we're just talking about, in this video, we're just talking about the person's preferences. So we want to, and indifference curve is just as the term describes, it is going to show different bundles in this space of consumption bundles that a consumer would be indifferent between, meaning that they would, in one sense you could think of it as having the same utility, but also just saying that they would be completely indifferent. You could give them one bundle or the other, and they'd be looking at it, and they can't see a dime's worth of difference between them. In their mind, they evaluate these bundles to be equivalent. They would give them an equivalent amount of satisfaction, happiness, or the term that, again, that we use in economics is utility. So one way we could do this would be to simply pick a number, pick a bundle, and start with this. And so we'll suppose we were to say to the consumer, let's imagine that I gave you 4 units of X and 4 units of Y. And imagine how happy you might be if I gave you that. And now let's think about changing that bundle. We say, well, suppose I was going to give you a bundle with only 3 units of X instead of 4 units of X. How many units of Y would you need to have so that you'd be indifferent between these two bundles? And maybe they might come back and say, oh, I need to have 6 units of Y. Alternatively, then you could have you might say, well, what if we gave you 5 units of X? How many units of Y might you need? Maybe they'd come back and say, maybe they'd only need 3 units of Y. And so forth down here. And then you think about, like, again, the way you could think about doing this is through an experiment or the mental gymnastics of you give a person one bundle to start and then ask them, well, tell me other bundles that you would find equivalent to this first bundle. And then maybe and for this curve, as with any other curve, what we would do is then take these numbers and plot them on our graph here, and then draw a curve connecting them. So you can come over here and say, okay, 0, 5. And so we have a point at 4, 4. So it's not there, we go out there, 4, 4. And then 3 and 6. And here you have 2 and 8. And coming this way, I gave them 5 units of Y and 3 units of X, or 5 units of X and 3 of Y. and then I get 7 and 2. Oops. This one needs to be a little bit lower. Right. So I've plotted the points that I had over here on this chart. And then we'll just assume that we will be able to connect these points with a nice smooth curve. And we would be doing this in such a fashion as to continuing what we said over there before. The idea that all of these bundles on this indifference curve are equivalent in the consumer's mind to the bundle 4-4. So we've traced out now one indifference curve. And this would give a person a given level of utility. This gives us a sense now, because this is a level curve of the utility function or a contour line. This would give us some level of utility. So I'll just call this a U1. In fact, well, actually, don't need to even use the U's because we're trying to do this without we'll call this I1, a level of utility of I, or an indifference curve I1. Now, if we started by giving the consumer a bundle with more X and more Y than 4-4, then we would have to trace out a different indifference curve. So suppose we gave them 6 and 6 to start with here. One of the assumptions we make about preferences, and we try not to make a lot of assumptions about people's preferences, but one of the things that we will assume about people's preferences is that more of a good is preferred to less. So if you compare 4-4 and 6-6, well, given that X and Y are both goods, then this person should prefer 6-6 to 4-4. So if we started by asking this person, imagine and give you the bundle of 6 units of X, 6 units of Y. Think about how happy that'll make you. Well, that level of happiness or satisfaction should be higher than the level of satisfaction that you get from the bundle 4-4. So 6-6 and 4-4 can't be on the same indifference curve. In fact, 6-6 should be on a more preferred indifference curve. And then we could, again, trace out other points, again, we're using the same sort of mental gymnastics or calculus that we did before to say to the person, imagine how much satisfaction you get from this bundle 6-6. What would be some other bundles that would give you, what would be some other consumption bundles that would give you the same amount of utility? And maybe they'd say, oh, 5 and 8, and then maybe 4, 11, and then maybe 2 and 17, and so forth. And they could give us some more bundles, and maybe 9 and 5 here. And then we'd come over here, and we could take these numbers and graph them as well. Because we're starting from 6-6, which is over here, compared to 4-4, we'll have an indifference curve that would end up being, well, let's see, I'm going to try to actually graph this somewhere, right? About there, it would start about there, and then we'd have some other, well, yeah, that's not very good at all. That's right at the 5 as I look at it now. So it'd be more like maybe here. And then we could trace out some other points, 5 and 8, that gives a point up here. And then 4 and 11 gives a point up here. And again, we plot all these points and then draw it out. We would get another indifference curve. And we'll label that one I2. And again, I2 has to be a more preferred level of, a more preferred indifference curve than I1, simply because, we were started with 6 and 6 here instead of 4 and 4, and more is preferred to less. So this has to be a more preferred indifference curve. And we could continue this on to generate, and again, this same kind of process. We could say, well, suppose we had started and told the person, imagine you're going to start with 10 units of each good. Think about how happy you would be with 10 units of this good, and then give us some other points that would make you just as happy as if you had 10 and 10. And then that would allow us to trace out another indifference curve. So what we really have is that we're going to assume that people's preferences, people have preferences, and they can be described by an entire family of indifference curves. And in fact, because of one of the assumptions that we make about preferences, one of this is called complete, then it turns out that any and every point in this consumption space should be on will be on an indifference curve, because a consumer will be able to evaluate any bundle that we give them here. And then we'll normally assume we'll assume there'll be some other bundles that they would be indifferent between whatever initial bundle we gave them, and we could trace out indifference curves in this fashion. And now we can see that these would be like the contour lines on a map, which if you're familiar with a map, and they show you different levels of elevation, contour lines will give you a sense when you're looking at a map of where the mountains and hills are. And we have this here. And one of the things we'll sometimes do is, in case there's going to be any confusion, sometimes we'll put an arrow on this graph showing the direction of increasing utility. So just in case as you look at or greater preference. It's usually going to be understood because in most economic contexts, we're talking about goods and more is preferred to less. So a consumer would want to move or would get higher levels of utility or get to more preferred bundles if they move in the northeast direction on this graph. They'd be a less preferred situation if they move down into the left or in the southwest direction or toward the origin of 0, 0, where they have no amount of either good. So we have an entire family of indifference curves, and these are going to describe people's preferences. Now, it's important because at this point, we're just describing people's preferences. We'll get to their the amounts of good that they can afford with their budget constraint. So there's going to be two parts to the consumer choice problem. One is the preferences described by indifference curves here, and then we're going to get to the budget line, or what a person can afford, and then we'll eventually put them together. But these are the indifference curves, and they describe a person's preferences. And if people had different preferences, they would have their indifference curve maps would have a different shape here. These curves that we have here, since they have sort of like a nice shape, they're like hyperbolas, if you're familiar with that, or these indifference curves will be convex, is another mathematical term to describe them. Another way to think of it is just like these nice, smooth, pretty-looking indifference curves. These would be what we'd call normal-looking indifference curves. So if on any homework assignment or an exam at some point in time, I want you to draw a diagram, and I say, assume the person has normal indifference curves. We mean this kind of indifference curve, these kinds of nice, smooth, I guess, quarter circle shaped indifference curves, okay? So that's indifference curves and how we would go about getting them.